But hello again, my name is Danielle Panagal. I am the program manager here at the Experience Innovation Center, which is a center of excellence for inventive product design and user experience located across from Purdue University in Indiana. Just to give you a look at what today's schedule looks like, we are super excited for today's event. We're going to hear from some really amazing speakers, bringing different perspectives, resources, and talking about their projects throughout the day in this event. Each talk, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how the flow is going to go, each talk will be followed by a 5-minute Q&A session. So if at any point you guys have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or the question box, and we will get to as many as possible during that Q&A session after their presentation. Before I hand it over to the speakers, I want to briefly share a little bit about the Experience Innovation Center and who we are. The center was started by UEGroup, which is a leading full-service UX firm based out in Silicon Valley. And they're trusted by some of the world's top brands for user experience, customer insights, and product strategy work. They started the Experience Innovation Center, which we're calling X Center for short, so you'll hear me say that throughout this event today, to really shake up and reimagine the user and customer experience field and place more emphasis on product innovation and invention specifically. The X Center's mission is to bring amazing minds together, and we're doing this by basically bridging the gap and bringing ideas from both industry and academia together to reimagine what it looks like to work, live, and play with technology in the future, but more specifically, technology that is 5 to 8 years out. So kind of that tangible future. And being located at Purdue University, we're very uniquely positioned to do just that with access to the university and local industry as well as national industry. So what we're doing, just to talk more specifically about what we offer, we partner with Purdue faculty and students as well as commercial entities to be a space where folks can really come build something new, test out ideas, enhance either their own individual capabilities or their team's capabilities, and then collaborate with others. So on site at our facility, we have a usability lab, which is open for everybody to use. It's IoT enabled and on the 5G network. We offer training, workshops, and consulting around inventive product design, UX, customer experience, and product strategy. And we host events like this one, as well as we plan to host many more events in 2022, as well as some conferences that'll tackle relevant topics, not only in the UX field, but bring perspectives, again, from industry and academia together. To just touch on the usability lab that we have on site. So across from Purdue's campus is our pilot facility, which features a lot of great tech. As I mentioned, it runs on the 5G network, and it's great for testing software, mobile, hardware solutions. And we've purposely built it to accommodate not only live observers, but be a solution for remote testing and hybrid testing as well. So let's say you want to run and moderate sessions from home or your office, but you don't want to go down to Indiana or you can't, you can run all those sessions wherever you are, and we'll bring in participants live on site to interact with products. So to echo my earlier statement, this is a pilot facility, and the X Center is a larger vision that's really focused on the future of innovation and products and how to best do that. So this lab is really just a piece of that. That is a little bit about us, but we have a packed schedule today, so it's time to get into the event. This is our first event, and we're going to hear some great speakers from UEGroup, Google, and Purdue University. We are super excited to be hosting this topic around inclusion and accessibility within UX, and we can all agree that it's important to create products that serve as many people as possible. Sometimes this topic can feel a little overwhelming with so many resources out there, and maybe this idea of I just don't really know how to get started, which brings us to our first speaker today, Blair Koeneman. So Blair is a senior UX designer at UEGroup who specializes in mission critical design for aerospace, enterprise, cybersecurity, and healthcare. Over the years in agency, Blair has noticed the gaps that can occur when companies are rapidly trying to crank out products without really considering the needs of those who might be ignored in the process. So her talk today is really going to ground us back in the basics of inclusive design and explore how you can incorporate it into your design process and your general way of thinking. So with that, I am going to hand it over to you, Blair.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me just get set up over here. All righty. All right, can you guys see my screen okay? All right, I'm gonna take that as a yes. All right, well, thank you guys so much for coming to this talk today. I'm very excited to talk to you. This is titled Quickstart Guide to Inclusive Design, and I'm just gonna hop right into it. So I am an experienced UX designer. Danielle just explained a bit about my background, but I work at UEGroup across many different industries, but I specialize in working on typically large platforms for high stakes environments. But I consider myself a beginner in terms of inclusive design. So within the various projects that I've worked on, we've worked with various types of companies who each have their own set of goals and priorities. But oftentimes inclusion and accessibility isn't necessarily a part of that conversation. So I hadn't been very exposed to inclusive design, and still I started learning more about it earlier this year and quickly realized the importance of educating myself, coming up to speed, and evolving my process. So one of the main things I've learned so far is that getting started with inclusive design can be overwhelming at first. There's many experts who have been working in this field for many years with many amazing resources out there. So this guide aims to help you, point you in the right direction with some basic concepts to help you get started, and some key resources along the way, which I'll point out later. So this just aims to help you dive in more efficiently and confidently. So what we're going to cover is understanding the basics, integrating inclusive design early on, learning from exclusion experts, realigning your design principles, and getting started now. So just a bit of an overview up front here of what inclusive design is and why it's important. So my first point here is that humankind, as we all know, is vastly diverse and multidimensional. We all have very unique experiences, characteristics, abilities, and limitations to those abilities. So, we have a bunch of characteristics, including age, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, the culture that we're a part of, the environment that we live in. We all just have a very unique combination of these different attributes. And we also each evolve throughout the course of our lifetime. So our abilities and limitations can vary along the way. Some statistics that I've seen throughout a lot of my initial education on this is 15% of the world's population has some form of disability reported in 2011, and 26% of adults in the United States have some form of disability reported in 2018. So that's, in terms of the US, that's about a fourth of the population. So I just wanted to point that out because I think, some people aren't aware of these numbers here. But also disabilities are on a spectrum, which is illustrated in this image on the right-hand side here. So there's permanent disabilities, which last longer than 12 months. This can include things like loss of sight, hearing or speech, any mobility impairments, or disabilities that aren't necessarily visible, such as dyslexia or autism. And then there's temporary disabilities, which refer to disabilities from an illness or other medical circumstances. That's more of a temporary situation. And then lastly, we have situational disabilities, which depend on the environment or circumstances that you're in. So in this case of the here row down below on this diagram, for example, a person who is deaf is experiencing this disability, all the time. A person with an ear infection, it's more of a temporary situation for them caused by something medical related. And then a situational disability in this case is a bartender or someone who's in, a noisy environment and is having difficulty hearing in that situation. So just to point this out, because no matter who you are, we all need inclusive design at the end of the day. And our unique combination of attributes forms the way in which we perceive and interact with the world. So, we have all these things that make up our identity and our perspective and how we move around the world. So our version of normal that we're very used to is going to differ from what others experience as normal. And as I think designers, in a lot of cases have instinctually been designing products for people like them in some cases, just because of certain biases that they possess, or maybe the way they're doing their overall process. And so it's just important to recognize that there's no such thing as a normal or average person to design for. And the digital and physical world are full of situations that are excluding portions of the population. Designers can inherently create mismatches between their products and the people who need to use them. So examples of a mismatch are when you can't access something for any reason, when you're trying to use a piece of software and it's really frustrating or confusing, or if you ever feel like you don't belong or you feel unwelcomed in some sort of interaction or situation. And all of these different mismatches that people are experiencing are creating barriers for participation. And these barriers or moments of exclusion can cause major consequences for large portions of the population. So limited to no access to essential information, which is a civil right of being able to access information people need in order to live their lives, find a job, live more independently. There's restrictions on who can participate and contribute when we create these mismatches. Feelings of not belonging, which can have consequences directly related to our health. Alienating large portions of the market, so thinking about things in more of a business case, either alienating or just not including a whole part of the market that could be reached out to. And then there's legal repercussions as well. So the statistic here on the right, about 3,500 ADA digital accessibility lawsuits were filed in 2020. And the number just seems to keep rising every year from the statistics that I was looking at. And then another important statistic I wanted to point out is 38% of people with disabilities were employed in the United States in 2018, and that's compared to 78% of people without a disability in the same year. So just a really large gap within that. So the goal overall of inclusive design is to remove these barriers that I mentioned as much as possible. And so it's impossible in some ways to design one solution that will be accessible to every single person, but we can design a diversity of ways for people to participate with the overall goal of including as many people as we can within our products and services. And this involves recognizing any existing or potential barriers within what you're creating so that they can be addressed. Just some quick definitions here before we move on to some other chapters in my talk. Inclusive design is a method. It's learning from and designing for the full range of human diversity to create solutions that are accessible, usable, and make people feel welcome. And that involves intentionally including people who likely experience exclusion so that we don't unintentionally exclude them. So keeping that at top of mind. And then accessibility is one aspect within inclusive design, but a very important one. It ensures that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with a product, service, or environment. So that one's more focused on making sure that people with disabilities can access your product, while inclusive design is an overall methodology that is more about designing for the full range of diversity. So at the end of each chapter here, I'm including some recommended resources. This slide deck will be available after the talk, so I really encourage you to dive in deeper with any of these topics. These are some resources I've identified as being really helpful. So yeah, I'm just kind of going to cover things at a high level as we go through here, but highly encourage you to look these up after the fact. So integrating inclusive design early on. So this is important for various reasons, some being You want to prevent alienating your users. You don't want to have a bad first impression or have a bad reputation as a company or organization and lose customers that way. There's avoiding non-compliance repercussions, such as legal risk. That's very important as well. And then reducing development fixes down the road. So if it's an afterthought, there could end up being a lot of maintenance or support needs in the future of your product. So some ways to integrate this early on. The first thing you could do if it's not a priority within your organization already is making a case for it to be a priority. And this is because having influence from the higher ups in your company or leadership and having company policies that dictate how people operate, it makes it a lot easier to work towards a goal when everyone is on board and you're not just kind of trying to do this on your own. So personally, within my company earlier this year, I did some upfront research on this area. I thought about what our business goals are as a company, and then I made a case to my boss about if I could dedicate a part of my time as an employee to be working on this and start thinking through and strategizing ways for our organization to do better. So I think it's really just finding the right angle for your organization. Each role should learn the inclusive principles for their domain. This really needs to be a team sport with each role contributing from their point of view and area of expertise. And then establishing inclusive activities and checkpoints within the beginning of your process and then throughout the rest of the process and as the product evolves as well. So some suggestions, and there's a lot out there. It really depends on what's important for your team's process. But beginning by recognizing our own cognitive biases, involving user input, doing internal reviews or internal checkpoints where you're checking up on your work along the way to make sure it's up to standards. And journey mapping is another tool I've seen widely used for this. So understanding biases within yourself and your team is really important here. Because that involves bringing awareness to the limitations in our own worldview and understanding. So it allows us to better spot inaccurate assumptions or stereotyping that affect our design decisions. So this process involves really just being honest with yourself, learning about the different cognitive biases that may be affecting things, and having vulnerable conversations with the people on your team to learn more about what may be influencing things. There's also some team activities you can do. I've called out a couple of them here. So there's this Cards for Humanity card game that could be a fun interactive card game to play with your team. And then there's different resources for learning about cognitive biases in general. So next we're going to talk about learning from exclusion experts. So when I use this term, it's referring to people who have experienced a lot of exclusion in their daily lives and maybe experts at recognizing it. And not only recognizing it, but also having a lot of really important and powerful ideas around how to best address their needs. So it's essential to include these experts in the design process because they're the only ones who can, really understand the full depth of their own lived experience and their needs and their emotions. So one starting point before, some people have limited resources or might not have direct access to talking to people. So I think a good starting point is to start consuming material written by those who commonly experience exclusion. This could be in the form of articles, books, documentaries, or podcasts. And while every person has a unique experience and everything you read and learn about is going to be from that one person's perspective, you can start to gain awareness of some challenges at a basic level that excluded communities face. And then in terms of being able to directly gain insights from exclusion experts, the most direct way is having diversity within your own design team. And this requires an inclusive hiring process. Another way you can do this is having user interviews, so gathering participants and gathering their perspectives and ideas early on in the design process. Or, you can have interviews really at any stage, but it is nice to do that research up front before you even start designing. There's this idea of sacrificial concepts, so early rough draft concepts to explore an overall direction and facilitate conversation. So that just helps you get a lot of different ideas that go in different directions to facilitate conversations in these interviews with participants. You could have co-design workshops, so developing ideas alongside users directly, inviting them to participate in that design process with you. And then lastly, user testing is very important. So testing your product at various stages with a diverse range of people. And I just wanted to quickly mention, so within that user testing process, when you're doing user testing with participants who have disabilities, there may just need to be some different considerations that you need to think about and prepare for upfront. So I had the experience this summer of doing a study with participants who are blind and have low vision, which is a type of study I had never done before. So had to do a lot of prep work there and learned a lot throughout the way. It was a really good experience. But some main things that I learned was only offer assistance when requested, becoming familiar with assistive technology. So this study involved using screen reader technology, which I hadn't used before and was not well versed in. So really had to practice with that so that the session would flow smoothly. And then allowing for extra time, whether that's extra time for the involvement of assistive technologies, or if any sort of adjustments need to be made, or anything like that at the start of the session. And then we're going to talk about realigning your design principles. So just an overall thing here, making your design accessible improves the experience for everyone. So there's accessible features that we all use pretty frequently. So there's certain features that are also widely used by non-disabled individuals. So having captions turned on when watching a video, or maybe using a keyboard to tab between different things on some sort of interface. And also situational limitations are common. So in this case, I have an image here of sunlight on a phone screen, which happens a lot to me at least. And so that affects, being able to see certain colors on the screen, or being able to discern the contrast between different things on the screen. At a minimum, following the web content accessibility guidelines for level AA compliance. So these are widely used web accessibility standards when working towards ADA and 508 compliance, which are laws in the US that businesses and government organizations must adhere to. So level AA means that you're designing for a site that almost all users can access. There's also level A and level AAA as well. So familiarizing yourself with the requirements is a good first step. And I have some resources for that at the end here. Creating accessible wireframe assets. In this image in the upper right corner here, this is an example of within our wireframe files that we use, we have certain assets that we all pull from, and making sure that those are accessible from the start. You could also have review checklists to use within your process. So whenever you have an internal review on something, or whenever you're checking over your design, just trying to kind of automate that process and making sure you're hitting all the aspects that you need to. And then using tools and plugins to help you check your work. So again, automating, using tools to check things will just make things faster for you. So a couple that I like to use are Stark, which is a plugin you can use in Figma and XD and some other softwares as well. And another one that I like is Sim Daltonism, which allows you to test for color blindness across anything that's on your screen. All right, so for the sake of time, I'm not gonna read through all of these, but there's general design principles that you, if you're a designer currently, you might already be, dealing with a lot of these, and that could be things like making sure your design is user-centered, simple and intuitive, has a clear hierarchy, and there's so many of those. But it's important to keep top in mind certain inclusive design principles, such as providing comparable experience, considering situation, being consistent, giving control, offering choice, prioritizing content, and adding value. And I included the link here so that you can learn a bit more about what each of those are, but making sure that those are all also prioritized within the principles that you're designing for. And lastly, just to practice here. So the more that you try things out and adjust your process, the more natural it'll become to you with time. And you'll, maybe start to develop your own various approaches for tackling certain things. So I really like this website called UXCel. It's spelled UXCEL. And it allows you to learn the different accessibility aspects and practice them with little quizzes that you can take. So last few points here, it's really just important to get started now. It's okay if you're at the start of your journey, if you feel a little overwhelmed or behind or guilty. I've felt these things. So if you want to talk about that, let's connect on LinkedIn and we can chat. But the most important thing is to make a commitment to start educating yourself and implementing these practices as soon as you can. And really just giving yourself time to absorb the knowledge and practice your understanding and just work towards making progress rather than needing things to be perfect right off the bat, because they likely won't go perfectly in the beginning. And this is really just a continuous and evolving learning experience, as well as just inclusive design in general is an evolving practice. So lastly, I would just recommend strategizing on how what we've talked about today ties into your unique situation, your process and your circumstances. And it might take a little trial and error to determine what works best for you and your team. So thinking about what types of inclusive design practices and activities would be most impactful within your work. What could you start today versus what will take a little bit longer, but you still want to have a roadmap to get there? And what could be automated just to, what tools could you use to streamline your process so that it can really become second nature. And that is all that I have for today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Blair. So I'm just popping back in for the Q&A portion. If you guys have questions for Blair, go ahead and toss them in the Q&A little chat window. But we do have one right now. So Blair, what do you wish that you knew before you got started in this space?
Let's see, I think I didn't know how hard it would be to get started. And so that's one of the reasons why I created this guide to kind of, give people a little bit more of a head start. But I think another thing is to not try to boil the ocean right in the beginning. I think as soon as I started learning and reading about all this, I just kind of wanted to jump into it right away. I felt like I needed to know all of it already right off the bat and create strategies for my team. But it's been a lot longer of a process than I thought, and it just needs to kind of come with increments of starting to come up to speed with it. And also, things that I've learned a few months ago for the first time now make a lot more sense today. So it just kind of takes some of that practice. And I finally feel like now I'm at the point to really start strategizing and coming up with actionable next steps for how my team should improve their process, but it's definitely taken some time.
Awesome. A lot of the questions that I'm kind of seeing come in are, about resources and other things that people can look into specifically with like UX research or just other articles and books. So I know that you're going to share this deck. So all of those resources, are those already in the slides?
Yes. Yeah, I tried to include resources that applied to the different things I talked about in each chapter here. And I also tried to not include too many because that's another thing I ran into when you just start Googling things, a billion things pop up. You don't really know how to hone in on things. So I really just chose my favorites for people to explore this information in more depth.
Perfect. And one last question here. So you had mentioned that, you brought this to your boss to work on inclusive design. So the question here is, were there any challenges in convincing your boss?
Not in my situation, which I feel fortunate with. I mean, I really did put a lot of work into it up front, though, of appealing to the needs of the business. And then also having a little bit of a plan in place of, can I dedicate 10% of my time each week to this sort of thing? So I think, yeah, it took that effort up front to make an impact. And then once I presented my case, he was very much on board. I also think, if your boss or whoever in your organization is not really on board with this after you make a good case for it, I think that's, something to think about as well. Because that might be a bit difficult to be working in an environment that doesn't prioritize something that you value.
Awesome. Well, there are some more questions rolling in. So I think what we're going to do is just take note of the questions that we have and reach out to you directly, Blair, and then hopefully get some more answers to shoot out to everybody after. But we are going to have to roll into the next speaker. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Great. So, all right. Our next speaker comes from Purdue University. So Dr. Natalia Rodriguez is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health and the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering, as well as the director of the Health Equity Lab, which is a lab on Purdue's campus that designs and implements innovative technologies to achieve health equity. Dr. Rodriguez has a long list of accomplishments, having earned degrees in chemical engineering and biology, and having earned degrees in chemical engineering and biology and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Boston University, an MPH in global health from Harvard, and postdoctoral training at the World Health Organization's Medical Devices Unit. We're very honored to have her join today, speaking on how Purdue's Health Equity Lab is focusing on human-centered and community-engaged design processes to achieve health equity for members of traditionally underserved communities, including Latinx and people experiencing homelessness. So Dr. Rodriguez, the stage is yours, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
And I'm going to see if I can do this better. There we go. And you can see my slides okay? Perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and really excited to follow Blair's talk. I really wish I would have had inclusive design resources when I got started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that my lab does and how we now incorporate human-centered technology design in everything we do, but kind of how we learned that the hard way. So what we do is design technologies to address health disparities. And by health disparities, I'm speaking about preventable differences in health outcomes that disproportionately affect marginalized populations and vulnerable populations. And health technologies often can exacerbate disparities, can often make these gaps wider, because if they're only accessible to already healthy people, it only prolongs, extends life expectancy in high income settings, improves health outcomes to all those people who have access, and then leaves everyone else even further behind. So my lab looks at technologies that do the opposite, that specifically look to reduce those gaps and address those health disparities. The example that I'm going to talk about today is focused on cervical cancer. The reason we study cervical cancer so much in public health is that it's an objective marker of disparity. And what I mean by that is if you look at a map of cervical cancer, it maps almost exactly to areas of low income and areas of marginalization. And the reason is that this disease is so preventable, it is very easily treated if you detect it early, that it really shouldn't be happening anymore. And we only really see it in areas of precarity and poverty and low access to healthcare. Despite all that, it is still, very widely prevalent throughout the world. Over 500,000 new cases every year, over 300,000 deaths every year. And most of these are happening in low and middle income countries and in low resource settings within high income countries. And the reason is that most women in the developing world or in low resource settings don't have access to screening, when we know that screening, particularly for human papillomavirus or HPV, the virus that causes cervical cancer, if we did screening for this virus even once in a woman's lifetime, we know that we would save many, many lives. So here in the US, most women see their OBGYNs every year, they get their pap smears, et cetera. But even if we only did that once in a woman's lifetime, we know that there would be significant reductions in cervical cancer mortality. So because of all that, the World Health Organization, they've published what they call the Essential Diagnostics List. It's looking at what are the characteristics of an ideal diagnostic test. So the ideal cervical cancer screening test would look for high-risk strains of HPV, specifically the DNA of those strains. The test would be independent of laboratory infrastructure, and meaning it's self-contained, standalone. And it would be fast. So we would be able to go from a patient sample to the answer in less than an hour. And the reason we have these design constraints is because in most low resource settings, there is limited laboratory infrastructure. Some places don't have electricity, they may not have running water. There may be an absence of trained workers. So you might have just minimally trained, not highly trained lab staff, certainly no pathologists or things like that. The labs may be poorly equipped. You may have transportation or storage conditions that are unrefrigerated. You have to consider that in your design of your diagnostic test. And there's also really high rates of patients being lost to follow-up in these places. What that means is they're unlikely to return for their results or to follow up on their results. And so that's why we need the tests to be fast, and we need to be able to give them their results in the same visit, ideally within the hour. So the WHO has set forth these guidelines in this kind of handy acronym, ASSURED, about what a diagnostic test, what this type of technology needs to, what criteria it needs to follow. So it needs to be affordable, it needs to be sensitive and specific. So we can't, take away from the quality of or the accuracy of the test just to make it affordable. It needs to be user-friendly. It needs to be quick and robust, rapid, equipment-free, as I mentioned, independent of lab infrastructure, and deliverable to end users. So my lab set out to design such a device for cervical cancer screening, one that would detect HPV, that the virus DNA, in cervical samples, and would fulfill all these criteria. This work is published, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the technical details, but just so you know what it looks like and how it works. This is the current prototype. It's a paper-based device that works actually very similarly to a pregnancy test, but we're able to detect DNA with it. So you would insert a sample here shown in blue in this sample port in the middle. You would wash away all of the sort of impurities or waste with a series of wash buffers. So the whole point being to isolate DNA here in this white circle, and all of the waste would flow to this waste pad that we would then remove. We would then incubate that DNA for about 20 minutes to amplify it to detectable levels. And then we would flow it out just like a pregnancy test, where visible lines would show up depending on the result of the test. And so we did a ton of clinical studies on this test. We found that it worked well in clinically relevant concentrations of the virus. We tested it with patient samples. These are pictures of positive samples. You see the 2 lines, just like a pregnancy test. These are negative samples down here. It was working very well. Everyone got really excited because it fulfilled all of these criteria. We filed a patent. We started a company. It was all very exciting. Fast forward a couple of years, and we start looking for, okay, where are the communities? What is the community that we can start doing some implementation of this test? We can start doing some, preclinical validation or feasibility studies, one that would benefit from such a technology. And at the time, I was working at the University of Miami in South Florida. This is a map of Miami-Dade County, and it's showing late stage diagnosis rates of cervical cancer. So the reason we looked at this was we wanted to find an area where most cases were being detected late stage, where it was almost too late to intervene. We wanted to, the meaningful intervention that our device could provide is to detect cases earlier, and, where we can make those things easily treated and women wouldn't be dying from this disease. So this map is showing the darker the green, the higher the rates of late stage diagnosis. And this dark green area down here, where, by the way, almost all cases were detected late stage, this is called Homestead. It's the heart of the agricultural region in South Florida. So if you drive by this area, what you will see is something like this, lots of agricultural fields and migrant farm workers working those fields. And it made a lot of sense to us at the time about, why cervical cancer rates might be so drastically high in this community. They're working low income jobs, they're likely uninsured, lots of social barriers to healthcare in general. And they're also migrant workers. And so we figured, they probably weren't coming back to clinics to get their results, even if they were screened. And so in my mind, this test could have impact in this community, could really help address these cervical cancer disparities that were so evident in the data. And I was so sure that this would be the answer. And I'm just going to jump to the punchline. I had never been more wrong about almost anything in my career. But that false assumption was really important because it fundamentally shifted how I approach public health and how I think we should all approach technology design. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this work. I started initially by reaching out. This is again a map of South Florida, and I just looked for organizations in Homestead that worked with the migrant worker population, local clinics, farm worker associations, local childcare centers where I could maybe find more women who may not be necessarily employed but are part of the farm worker community. And I said, I wanted to work with them to see if we can try to work together to implement this technology. And a lot of the feedback that I got was, well, how do you know that this is actually what they need? How do you know that these are the real barriers to cervical cancer screening? How do you know that this type of technology would even be acceptable or usable in this population? You don't really know anything about this community. And this was a hard pill to swallow, but as a researcher, we went back to the drawing board and partnered with these organizations to go back to the basics and ask some very basic initial questions of, okay, what are the specific needs and barriers of this farm worker community in South Florida in accessing cervical cancer screening services? And knowing what those specific barriers are, what are some facilitators? What are some potential ways to support this population in accessing cervical cancer interventions? And only then can we really understand where this type of technology might fit into this equation. So I'm just going to share some very quick high-level findings from our initial study on those two questions. Some of the needs and barriers that we identified had a lot to do with knowledge gaps. So there was a lot of undereducation about cancer and about the benefits of early detection. So we heard things like, those who seek shall find. So, if you look for cancer in my body, you're going to find it, and I don't want to know. A lot of misconceptions about the disease and fear of the disease. So we heard things like, the word cancer is like mentioning death. The first thing that comes to mind is death. The treatment is worse than the cancer itself. So just some general misconceptions that were keeping people from being screened, even if they had access to be screened. We also identified a lot of sociocultural barriers. So this population is largely undocumented. And so there was a lot of mistrust and fear associated with that immigration status. They were afraid to ask for help. They were afraid to go to clinics or to sign up for, government services because they were afraid of being deported. There was a lot of cultural family dynamics too that we had to deal with. So one of them being machismo, where men wouldn't let their wives go get screened, particularly for cervical cancer that requires like a pelvic exam, right? There was also a lot of modesty and shame, from women themselves, just how embarrassing to have to open my legs for a doctor to see down there. Just culturally, it wasn't appropriate. But despite all that, we also found really important strengths of the community and really important things that could serve as facilitators to healthcare access and to cervical cancer screening. One of them being this concept of a community health worker. I had never heard of community health workers before working in this population, but there were several of them that were well known. And for those of you who've never heard of them either, community health workers are members of a community, or they know the community really well, and they are somehow linked to health or social services. So they might be employed by a community clinic or a community-based organization that provides social services. And they're really like these go-to people. Honestly, most of them in this community were like nosy, outspoken women who everybody knew, and they knew everybody else. And they were well-known and trusted. And so those relationships enabled them to be that go-to person. We heard things like, we do everything for our communities. We help people find where to get their kids vaccinated. We help them pay their light bills. They were very, very passionate about sharing knowledge with the community. So, one woman told me, we always need to keep educating ourselves to be able to help the community as much as we can. She was always reading up on new diseases and new technologies and new cures and teas and all these things so that she could support her community as much as she could. And their role in this community was so prominent that they really were the ones to create connections to the health system. They let people know where they could go, where they didn't need to fear, what doctor they should see, where to sign up for services, etc. So we took all of that information that we learned and we brought it back to the drawing board, and we said, how can we redesign and introduce this new device, this HPV test, in a way that would circumvent and also help address some of these key sociocultural access barriers that were currently impeding cervical cancer screening in the community. So we learned that this technology alone was never going to solve any of these problems. However, it could be an important tool in a much broader and much more comprehensive intervention that was rooted and started first and foremost with a community health worker. So this is really where the workforce innovation piece comes in, is who is going to deliver these technologies, who is going to connect the community that needs it to the technology itself. And so the community health worker, if we can equip her with the right educational materials so that she can educate her community on the disease and on the benefits of early detection, if we equip her with the right tools, for example, a self-sampler, where women can take their own vaginal sample and don't have to go to a clinic, don't have to get a pelvic exam, and also equip her with the right instructional materials so she can teach women to use it properly. We could potentially introduce an intervention where a community health worker goes door to door or does community health fairs, teaches women about the disease, shows them how to take their own sample that they then give back to her, and then she can run the test and give them their results right on the spot. And those who are positive and at risk for cancer can then be connected directly to care. So this seemed like a really powerful potential intervention. We're now piloting this in several communities, particularly marginalized Hispanic communities with high rates of cervical cancer. But what is particularly important in the work that we're doing is engaging the community health worker early on in the design of this test. When we taught her to use it initially, and we're now teaching groups of community health workers to use these technologies, they have a lot of feedback. They have a lot of opinions about how this should work or how simple it is to use, how usable it actually is in real world settings. Can they operate it properly? Can they interpret results correctly? What needs to be redesigned to make this feasible in the settings where it's actually needed? So that process and I won't go into this since I think Blair described this really beautifully, is what we call human-centered design in our lab. We really aim to understand the context specifically. We design specifically with user requirements in mind. And then we bring those prototypes back to the community. We bring them particularly through the community health worker. We get their feedback, we reiterate, we do this over and over again until it's right. And we do the same thing with the overall intervention. So not just the technology itself, but the kit that it comes in, the instructional materials that accompany it, the educational materials about the disease itself, the self-sampler that's now part of that kit, and how to use that. All of that goes through this human-centered design process so that the end users, the vulnerable populations we aim to serve, are the ones really informing what that looks like. And the whole point of this, and really the whole point of my lab, is so that we don't continue to make these. This is what's called the implementation gap, or the translational gap, a really common term in implementation science, that basically just means you have on one side really brilliant scientists and engineers producing really awesome technologies in the lab, really cool widgets that unfortunately never make it to the other side, where you have patients and people who could really benefit from these innovations. And how do we get them to make it to that other side so that we don't keep making more of these things that never get to people? So that is what my lab does. We are an interdisciplinary and translational science group. We do lots of different things and work in lots of different areas, lots of different diseases. But the three main areas are: one, understanding context, so doing qualitative and participatory research with communities, with community leaders and organizations to understand what are the actual needs and what are the actual things that may help address those needs. Then we take all of that information and we design human-centered technologies. We do this in collaboration with lots of biomedical engineers on campus. We're working right now with my colleague, Jackie Linus, who's designing HIV self-tests for populations who inject drugs and are a particular risk of HIV. We're working with those populations to understand, would they use them? How would they use them? Why would they use them? Where would they use them? How can we improve the design to make them actually impactful in health disparities? And then we train community health workers to use them, and they give us really important design feedback. And they're also the key to delivering those resulting interventions and those resulting technologies back to their communities. And just, I know I have like 1 minute, but just because this is such a hot topic right now, we're also working with a local homeless population here in Lafayette. This is LTHC, Lafayette Transitional Housing Center, our amazing community partner. We have community health workers based at this shelter delivering COVID education and COVID resource navigation. So helping homeless individuals get their stimulus checks and get their vaccines and all of that. This community, as you can imagine, has been extremely hard hit with the pandemic. And so what we're doing now is we trained community health workers to use COVID rapid diagnostic tests. And this has been really game changing in this community, in this setting, because you can ensure and improve the uptake of this technology in this really vulnerable population because you have community health workers at the forefront. They are trusted in this population, they are known in this population. And so they're really the ones ensuring that these technologies get taken up, and not just the testing, but also the vaccines. So I'm happy to talk more about this if people have questions, but I know I'm out of time. I want to just leave my email here, Natalia at Purdue. Please reach out. I'm always interested in working with people, with like-minded folks who care about inclusive design. And I'm very, very happy to take any questions at this point.
All right. Oh, my camera wasn't on. Sorry about that. So we have some questions rolling through. So the first one is, are participants usually eager to participate in this research, or do they have, kind of some hesitations when you're approaching them?
That's a great question, and one that, we get a lot, especially in academia, where there has been a history of exploiting populations and of helicopter research where academics go in, get what they need, and then never come back. What we have found is that is why we work so closely with community health workers. They are members of the community. So not only are they the gatekeepers to those communities for us, but they also hold us as researchers accountable. They make sure that our findings make their way back to that community, actually impact the community, and are actually informed. So we've had a lot of luck with that because they assist with recruitment and informing people about the study and why it's important. And that actually has really helped to get people not just on board, but really excited about the work that we're doing. It is really humbling to see a homeless population eager to help make things better, not just for their community, but for other homeless communities. So I think it's just really key to make sure people understand why you're doing what you're doing, and why their feedback is so important to the work. And I think that in our experience, that has really allowed for meaningful data collection and really meaningful results going back to the community. Great question.
Great. And then are you still implementing this for cervical cancer, or has the focus kind of shift solely to COVID testing or other areas?
No, so we're still trucking away with our cervical cancer work. That's the farthest along because it was how it all started for us. So we're working with, I'm now based at Purdue here in Indiana, and we are working with Hispanic populations in Lake County. It's the county that borders Chicago, Illinois. Very, very high rates of cervical cancer there, even higher than we saw in South Florida. And some similar barriers, but a lot of differences too. This is a more urban setting and very, very different context. And so learning a lot there, but finding that a lot of the facilitators, like the community health workers and the self-sampling and all of that, is similarly improving outcomes in this population. So trying to expand that work a little bit. And then we're always working with other, I don't design all these technologies. My focus has been the cervical cancer device, but we're working with engineers designing HIV tests and COVID tests, and even we're branching out from diagnostics to some wearable technologies and involving end users in the design of those too.
Awesome. So this last one, I think we have time for one more, and it'll be kind of like a two-parter. I guess two questions. But do you have any recommended resources for the anthropological aspects that you've touched on? And then also, if someone was interested in doing this kind of work and getting a job in this space, what advice would you have for them?
So resources, yes, tons. I was an engineer, solely an engineer, like trained in the lab, and knew nothing about community-based research or participatory action research, and just read a bunch of books and taught myself how to enter this space. And there's now even better kind of concise resources. So yeah, I'm very happy I can share those in the chat right after this on the anthropological resources, but also I know Blair shared many, but I have maybe a couple more of the human-centered design resources as well that my team uses a lot that I'm happy to share. How to get a job in this area. I'm not sure what area specifically the question is about, but this idea in general about using health technologies to address disparities and to improve public health for vulnerable populations. This requires all kinds of thinkers and all kinds of interdisciplinary experts. So my lab alone, we work with engineers, but we also work with anthropologists, sociologists, pharmacists, obviously people in public health. I'm blanking and my students are going to get mad at me, but lots of different disciplines. And so it really, I would say, find the thing that speaks to you and become an expert in that and apply that. I think the way that Blair described it was really great. You can apply these principles to anything, and it's never too late. It's never too late to ask people how the thing you're working on can improve their lives and how you can do it better. So I think there's lots of ways, but if anyone has any specific questions or want to talk about anything, please email me, and I'll drop my email in the chat as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. And similar to Blair and every other speaker, we'll be sharing the slides and the resources as well following the event. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all.
Okay. So presenting our next speaker, they come directly from the UX design program at Purdue. Dr. Rua Williams is an assistant UX design professor with over 10 years of industry experience in video game development, system design, 3D modeling, and animation. They earned their PhD in human-centered computing from the University of Florida. Today, Dr. Williams will be sharing about Design Justice Network, an international community of people and organizations who are committed to rethinking different design processes so that they are centered for people who are too often marginalized by design. This network offers principles to guide more intentional, attentive, and accountable design practices. And this talk is going to illustrate how common UX design practices continue to objectify disabled embodiment and rely on biased cultural tropes of disabled life and what we can do to change that. Dr. Williams, I will hand it off to you. And I think you might be muted.
I am. I'm also struggling to find the right screen. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen. You can see my slides and you can hear me. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this talk I'll be covering, I will be discussing ways that we can challenge objectification in user experience design practices. A brief introduction to myself. I know that you gave one, but I just want to contextualize my talk in my modes of scholarship, which are involved at the intersection of critical disability studies and science and technology studies. So we will talk about the design justice principles, and we will talk about common UX practices that I would like attendees to think about more critically and challenge. I will discuss specifically what I'm calling the stakeholder trap, and then we'll end with recommendations for future practices. So the Design Justice Network is a collection of activist scholars that came out of the Allied Media Conference, and they have developed a set of 10 principles for design justice. And these are briefly stated, they use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems, center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process, prioritize design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer, view change as emergent from an accountable, accessible, and collaborative process rather than as a point at the end of a process. And we see the role of the designer as a facilitator rather than an expert. And I should contextualize that the role of the designer as a facilitator of understanding community needs and problems. It's not necessarily meant to delegitimize design expertise of designers. That everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and that we all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to a design process. We share design knowledge and tools with our communities. We work towards sustainable, community-led, and controlled outcomes. And this really is highlighting some of that translational gap that the previous speaker discussed, in that design justice centers solutions that actually can continue to be maintained beyond the involvement of the original design team. And they're working towards non-exploitative solutions that reconnect us to the earth and to each other. And that before we seek new design solutions, we look for what is already working at the community level, and we look for like the strengths and the strengths of the communities that we're working with. So some questions that I have that, so this is not meant as a critique of the Design Justice Network or their principles. This is meant as a contextualizing set of critical ways of engaging with those principles, because as with anything, when you make it a bulleted list, you can sort of misinterpret and misapply. And so who decides what is healing and who defines empowerment? Who is most directly impacted, and what if the indirect impact is more dangerous? Now, who decides what is already working? and more basically, who is in charge? And when I talk about who's in charge, I am building off of the work of an activist scholar, Roland Johnson, who was a leader of the cognitive disability activist movement. And he was a survivor of the Pennhurst State School Hospital in Pennsylvania during the 1950s and 60s. And what Roland Johnson discusses in his public speaking and in his leadership was the notion of control. When he would speak with people that were in institutional settings, including group homes, he would ask them, who's in control? Are you in control or are staff in control? Who's in charge over you? And so Roland Johnson's work is really focused on the idea that you can take somebody out of an institution, but you can continue to institutionalize them in community settings if you don't actually give them self-determination and power. And so common UX practices that that we use to try to engage empathetically with marginalized communities, but we can actually do so in a way that continues to objectify them, is personas. So, and this doesn't mean you shouldn't ever use personas. All right, this is more about, you should critically think about your purpose of using a persona. And so if you are relying on a persona to give you sort of that fallback to justify your design choices without actually considering whether or not those design choices would be agreed upon by actual human beings rather than your personification of a set of people, then you may be inappropriately relying on a persona for your work. And it's always important to remember that personas as a practice came out of marketing and not out of design specifically. And so in that way, when you're working on personas, you could be inadvertently sort of reproducing these normative assumptions about what the optimal user is, what the optimal customer is. They often tend to reduce facts about disabled life to a spectacle for the purpose of valorizing the design. And so they will often talk about this persona user's disability as the core problem that the design solves. And that's a really problematic approach to designing for disabled people. Another issue in common UX practice is journey mapping. And again, this doesn't mean you should never journey map. This means that you should critically think about what your purposes and motivations are in the journey map and how they might inadvertently flatten the diversity of experiences that you're attempting to design for. So when you're journey mapping for a user type that you are sort of typifying based on some axis of disability, you may be making assumptions about the cognition and motivation of the user that don't hold up in real life. And this is where detailed, not just detailed user interviews, but detailed in-depth and authentic relationships with disabled people are really important when you're trying to do design work in these spaces. And then another issue that I want to focus on is stakeholder interviews. Obviously, I'm not saying that you should never do stakeholder interviews. These are essential components to good design work. But what I want to do is interrogate this notion of the stakeholder, because sometimes when we discuss stakeholders, we can elide power disparities in communities of users. And before I go, whoops, that's not backwards. Okay. Before I go on to this challenging of the stakeholder interview, I want to bring up some scholarship of disabled design scholars. Bennett and Rosner, in a piece published in AltChi in 2019, write a piece about the promise of empathy and knowing the other. And in this piece, they critiqued a lot of the design thinking practices that come directly out of the IDEO group. And so when you are thinking about practices that may help you form empathy with a user group that you don't identify with, you may want to challenge that motivation itself, because actually sometimes the way that we think about empathy in popular conversation is that we think about it as understanding the experiences of another person. But actually, it's not a requirement that we understand someone else in order to believe them. So we shouldn't necessarily be relying on this sense of understanding or this sense of shared worldview as much as we should just be believing people even when they're different from us and their experiences maybe even contest or confront our own. And so in this piece, they advocate for being with rather than being like, and seeking partnerships rather than representation. This is a process of ongoing attunement, that you're always in relation with the people that you're designing with, and that you recognize and work with the asymmetries in relations that this can create, in particular, this notion that there will not be a reciprocal and even symmetrical notion of understanding. You cannot actually understand what it's like to be blind if you are not blind. And it's actually not necessary. You just need to believe the testimony of the people that you're in design relationships with. And so this brings us back to what I'm calling the stakeholder trap. And so oftentimes in design work, we are given the names and the contact information of who is considered to be our stakeholders. And these are a diverse range of people. Sometimes they are corporate in nature, and sometimes they are from the community. But actually, oftentimes the stakeholders that are named have implicit or explicit power over other social agents in a community. And one of the strongest examples of this that you can see in my own work is parents of disabled children. So oftentimes when we're doing design work for disability in childhood contexts, we rely on the testimony of parents, therapists, and teachers over the testimony of children because of things that we're led to believe about whether or not children can be believed or even conversed with about their own experiences. And so what happens is we rely on the testimony of these social agents that hold power over children, and also are often imbued with their own kinds of internalized ableism and internalized expectations for what the optimal disabled childhood is. And usually what that amounts to is that societally we believe a disabled childhood is tragic, and that the work of a disabled child is to become as normative and non-disabled as possible before adulthood. And this conceit is pervasive in even disability advocacy communities. And unfortunately, what this causes is a strong current of epistemic harm to disabled children when they're basically given a job throughout their childhood, which is to become non-disabled and to overcome their disability. And then disabled adults in disability scholarship will report that this experience of being sort of non-consensually enrolled in compulsory overcoming causes them to have a sense of loss of childhood and a loss of the experiences of just getting to be a child and to play and to exist in their own bodies as it is. And again, that's not to say that there should be no therapy or that there should be no design interventions for disabled children. It's just that there is a different way of thinking about what an optimal disabled childhood is. And most of the time we think about it very incorrectly. And this is not just in childhood context, but I think it's an easier one to discuss. But at the same time, when we work with disabled populations that are in adulthood, we also often tend to defer to parents still and other forms of institutional caregivers like clinicians. And so drawing from my work on a chapter called Nothing About Us Without Us, Transforming Human Systems Engineering and Participatory Design, some of the recommendations I have for mitigating these issues is to firstly attend to power. And that is sort of an idea of mapping out the true network of social power in a stakeholder relationship and finding who is actually the most impacted, even if that's indirect. So even if they're not directly your stakeholder, getting a sense of who's actually impacted by when this system is designed and deployed, whose life is it actually being integrated into? And so oftentimes we find that the person you were told to listen to is down here, but they're actually the social infrastructure for a large number of people that have had no say in what has been designed. Another thing that we discussed is called consciously returning voice. And so there is a tendency in user experience design and design more broadly to talk about giving voice to the voiceless or to the unheard. And in research in non-speaking communities, a scholar named Christine Ashby at the Syracuse University actually has said, voice is not mine to give or uncover. Everyone has a voice, even if that voice does not come out of their mouth. And everyone has the ability to testify to their own experiences and desires, even if the way that they communicate and the way that they language is not normative. And so returning voice involves practices of overturning silences, engaging in multimodal forms of testimony collection, so not relying only on oral speech or on the traditional forms of interviews, and considering multimodal analysis of that data. So looking at both video, audio, drawings and sketches that people may do, really understanding the full complexity of somebody's testimony. Next recommendation is to mediate kairotic space. Now, kairotic space is a very niche concept from disability studies, and this is a concept developed by Margaret Price in her book, Mad at School. And so a kairotic space is just a nice, concise way to describe the kinds of precarious relationships that happen in social groups, particularly where there are power disparities within the room. So in a classroom setting where there's a teacher and the students themselves may be stratified by various kinds of social classes. The lab is definitely a kairotic space, and the user study space is definitely a kairotic space. And so you have the real-time unfolding of events with impromptu communication that's required, encouraged, or even compulsory for participation, in-person contact. And I would like to modify this now that we are in the era of Zoom, that this is really just synchronous contact, and that there's a strong social element and that there's high stakes. And so in the case of a user design session, what may be the most high stakes for a participant is the notion that they have this limited window within which to make their desires heard. And if they don't achieve that in that session, then they have oftentimes a sense of failure, not only for themselves, but for their communities, because they have sort of been called to represent a larger body of people in your lab. And then also practice humility. And I don't have a lot to say about that other than just to really accept the fact that you cannot fully understand another person and that you don't have to, and that none of us are the quote unquote modest witness of Donna Haraway's theorizations, that there is no such thing as the objective, impartial, and pure scientific authority. Again, repeating Ashby, voice is not ours to give or uncover. Even the silence to speak truth to power and the void of our deliberate inattention. So whenever it is that you think that there is someone who is unheard or is voiceless, you consider that a failure on your part to hear or to perceive. And so finally, I just wanted to give a very brief, short list of disabled makers, because disabled people are already engaged in practices of design. Some examples are Hell on Wheels Design, who modifies accessibility and mobility equipment to fit the aesthetic needs of the user. And in particular, Hell on Wheels enjoys a punk aesthetic. EDS Splints is somebody who makes finger splints for people with a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility spectrum, which causes laxity in collagen and basically causes hypermobile joints. And so these splints make it easier to literally hold things and to move about in daily life. Zabretta Makes It Work is another multiply disabled and Black woman who does work with understanding the daily practices of hacking your own accessibility equipment. And so basically, many times the equipment that people live with every day malfunctions on a daily basis, and disabled people are experts in that troubleshooting and can consult each other. And that's the kind of community that Zabretta makes. And those are more examples. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. So for a first question here, thinking about the UX process, do you suggest a whole redesign of the UX process or just incorporating things like chaotic space into each step?
Yeah, no, it's more like being more critical about your motivations for using different design practices and understanding them as tools, and as tools they may be used for better or worse in different contexts. And so like to really consider the motivations behind why you're choosing a certain tool may help inform the way you use that tool, or even your decision to use a different one. And so you may find that actually persona is not useful for me in this context, or a persona is useful for me in this context, but I'm not going to be using it as a legitimization for like a certain design feature when it's based on an assumption that the disability that the persona has is bad or undesirable, right? So there's just like a different way of thinking about how the tools can be applied.
For journey mapping, you had mentioned that early in the talk. How do you kind of not assume their cognition or motivation? Do you create several different maps based on different scenarios, or is there a particular way you recommend going about that?
I think in particular, when you're working with a marginalized group of people that you really are not familiar with, that you can't effectively do a journey map without like authentic relationships and with like at least some in-depth interviews with people from that population. And so journey mapping as a practice is inherently assumptive in that you're making assumptions about what the user is going to do and why. And that can be useful as a tool, but it is more likely to fail if you don't actually understand that group of people. And again, like I said, you don't actually have to understand them so much as believe them. So if you have no real basis for like an authentic understanding, then you need to reach out to people from that community so that you have the testimony that you need in order to make the connections between what they say they experience and what you need to map out.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have one here that's kind of long. So, okay, let me try to read this really quick. Kat Holmes talks about having disabled designers on your design team. They may not be opening up a graphic tool or actually designing, and they may not be able to see what's on the screen, but we need to change our concept of what the actual like designer is, as opposed to thinking of someone who can't access traditional design tools. Do you feel that that fits in with what you're advocating for?
It does. There is some complication there, which is like when we do bring in marginalized people and figure them as quote unquote co-designers, oftentimes what we are doing is inadvertently sort of extracting knowledge from them and also tokenizing them. And that's not to say that you should not invite disabled people into your lab to be designers, but you need to be really critical about that relationship and really sort of proactively identify when you may be using that person versus actually giving that person equal access to design authority. And so another activist scholar on disability and technology that I like to point people towards is Liz Jackson. So Liz Jackson is most prolific on Twitter, and she does work on many different topics of disability and design. One of which is called the disability dongle, which she describes as being that elegant solution to a problem disabled people didn't know they had. So this is what happens when you design something without input of disabled people and you just make this like useless thing that is solving not the actual problem. But also Liz Jackson talks about what she's calling hyphen status. And that's what happens when we bring disabled people in as co-designers and not authentically as colleagues. Mm-hmm. And so when we do that, oftentimes we're separating them out as sort of like a second class of designer and not really giving them the full access to authentic design control and authority.
Good. Well, thank you so much. That's all the time that we have. I know that you've dropped your email in the chat and everyone will have access to this after the fact. So I encourage everyone to reach out with any follow-up questions as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
Up next, we have 2 more talks left in today's event. This next one is a speaker duo who also comes out of Purdue University, Dr. Brad Duerstock and Dr. Brandon Pitts. Dr. Duerstock is a professor in both the School of Industrial Engineering and Biomedical Engineering at Purdue, which is also where he earned his PhD in neurosciences. Dr. Pitts is an assistant professor in the School of Industrial Engineering, as well as the director of the Next Gen Human Systems and Cognitive Engineering Lab at Purdue. Dr. Pitts received his PhD from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in Industrial and Operations Engineering. Their talk today is going to discuss their design process and work of the Easy Rider, which is a solution giving people with disabilities the means to use autonomous vehicles. So with that, I am going to hand it over to the 2 of you. I don't know if I have to share.
Okay, can everyone hear?
Yep.
All right. And are you
Perfect.
seeing the slides? Perfect. Okay.
Slides and you. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting us and the opportunity to talk to you about our project. It is called the Easy Rider. It's a very long acronym, but it conveys some of the principles. If you recollect the movie, it's been quite a while, but what it stands for is the efficient, accessible, and safe interaction in a real integrated design environment for riders with disabilities. So this is a project that is in part of a competition sponsored by the Department of Transportation to look at inclusive design in the future of autonomous vehicles. And so this is a very forward thinking of the DOT that realize that people with disabilities will likely be, are possible to be early adopters of this emerging technology. And so to get them on the ground of how we design what autonomous vehicles should look like, and including this segment of the population we think is a great idea. And that's what this design competition is all about. Yeah.
All right. So as Brad mentioned, what we're going to talk to you about today is a part of this 2020 US DOT, what they coined IDC, or Inclusive Design Challenge. In the beginning of 2020, they released this solicitation for design concepts that would enable people with a wide variety of disabilities, including physical, sensory, and cognitive disabilities, to be able to use automated vehicles for a variety of reasons. And so back in October of last year, we actually submitted a proof of concept, which was a 20-page document that outlined to the DOT how we wanted to assemble such a vehicle that would support the needs that they were interested in. And so from that submission, we found out at the beginning of this year that we were one of 10 semifinalists. We were awarded $300,000 to actually build what we had proposed in the 20-page document. Where we are now is working on stage 2, which is the prototype and demonstration. That is going to wrap up in about, I would say, 8 months now. So that's going to be June 2023. I'm sorry, June 2022. There are 3 different prizes. Total prize money is $2 million. First place will receive $1 million. Second place, you can see here on the screen, so on and so forth.
So, just kind of get us on to understand the problem. First of all, and this is probably not going to be too surprising to many of you who looked at inclusive design, that there's over 25 million Americans with travel limiting disabilities. So they have difficulty going to work, going to school, groceries, or just seeing the doctor. And so how do they participate in society is really limited by their transportation options. Autonomous vehicles, as you can imagine, someone who is blind, an AV with full autonomy could take someone to go independently wherever they wish. And but that is the future of autonomous transportation. The Society of Automotive Engineers have actually levels from 0 to 5, describing these different levels of autonomous transportation. What the DOT design challenge is really focusing on achieving level 5 or full automation, where no one has to be in the seat, no one has to be near a steering wheel, maybe there's not even a steering wheel, and that this vehicle will be able to take them wherever they need to go. So you can see how this would be a huge game changer for people with disabilities. What aspects do we need to look at in terms of AV transportation? Well, everything from vehicle entry to exiting, situational awareness, so they know where they're at, they know they're at the right destination. If there's an accident, to understand what's occurring, and that's safety, and then how to be independent controllers of this device, this machine, this vehicle. Yeah. We have assembled a great team, Easy Project, based on their backgrounds in accessible transportation. And I'll just go through our major players. Broad Ability, they're actually locally here in Indiana. They are probably the largest maker of wheelchair ramps and lifts for vehicles, for wheelchair accessible vehicles. Scheffler Paravan, they're out of Germany. They specialize in alternative vehicle controls for people with disabilities. Local Motors, which in the picture you can see is this toaster looking vehicle, and that's the Ollie, and they built this and they're testing it right now throughout the world as a AV for commuter use. Prehensile Technologies, which is a startup company that helps understand the robotics and needs of power wheelchair users. And then us at Purdue, Professor Pitts and myself. Our strategy in this design competition, and this was very open from the DOT's point of view, you could focus on one aspect or the whole challenge of getting someone from point A to point B. And that is the tack we took, is to look at this integrated design approach, because not every design feature lives by itself. They really depend on each other. So that's how we looked at this design challenge. And I'll just go through different components, 1 through 5, I think. And we'll discuss different aspects really from the start of how do you get someone into the vehicle? The biggest challenge being, of course, people in wheelchairs. And we work with Broad Ability as experts in this field, and they were already working with local motors in developing a ramp that would fit that form factor, which is really constrained, and yet it's lightweight, has the capacity of power wheelchairs, and meeting the ADA slope requirements. There's a picture there. Other aspects of entering the vehicle that we'll show some just some simulated views of. It shows that, or really focuses on the problem that many accidents occurs during transportation, but mostly when wheelchair users are entering or exiting the vehicle. And so we have a guidance system in place to help for proper ingress and egress. And also this is done really before they even get into the vehicle. They can access a lot of these features through a smartphone app that they have with them. And this is really a user interface that they already have that's programmed, that's designed, set up for their special needs or preferences. So when you board, there's a lot of options. Just think about if you go on a public bus, you automatically scan and find what seats are available for someone who is blind. And again, I want to focus that this is not limited to just wheelchair users or one particular disability. We're looking at several types, including blind individuals and those in wheelchairs and those with maybe cognitive impairments. One feature we wanted to incorporate was the possibility of having a very reconfigurable seating system that accommodates both wheelchair users and those who wants to use the seats. These seats could be folded up automatically to accommodate wheelchair users and also to inform a blind passenger, for instance, which seats are taken if this is a shared riding system. Securement is a big issue. If you find a seat, use a seat belt that's there. Wheelchair users, they have to have a tie-down system. Since we want this system to be independent, we need a lockdown system that is easy to be independently used by the wheelchair user. Right now, the current practice is that the bus driver or whatever attendant would come in and tie down the wheelchair. So we have an automatic tie down system that was developed by Braun Ability. Okay. Yeah, and after that, I'll have Professor Pitts talk about the rest.
All right, thank you. So what Professor Duerstock has talked about so far was mostly the physical components of the vehicle. What I want to transition to is the user experience. And one of the things that we think that is unique about the Easy Rider project is that we're one of the teams, at least in the initial design phase for what the other teams shared that they were doing. One of the teams, one of the few teams that are actually looking at both the in-vehicle experience as well as the physical construction of whatever aspect of the vehicle teams are looking to design for. So there is one unique system that we have, a concept called the situation awareness system that is going to include both exterior and exterior cameras, both in the vehicle and outside. That's going to help with a number of different things. And so you can see the pictures here on the right show the video feed of what a person would see. So if a person with a wheelchair or in a wheelchair is interacting with the vehicle, okay, they'll actually be able to see two monitors that are above their heads that would show them both what's happening in the inside of the vehicle as well as outside. What's happening outside is important for them to be able to know how to get out, that there are no obstacles in the environment preventing them from exiting properly. And then for the inside of the vehicle, this may give them information about their relation to other passengers in the vehicle. We're also designing for there to be emergency situations. So we're under the premise that there might be a remote operator who may need to intervene at some point in time. If that becomes the case, then this remote operator would also have access to this live video feed to be able to assist the person as needed. So that's our fourth component. But also as a part of that system is something that we've coined called the multimodal user interface, which is really an integrative interface that allows the passenger to control different functions of the AV. So this would include getting in and out of the vehicle, seating and selecting seating, navigation, in-vehicle climate control, and entertainment, for example. For this approach, we are using a number of different emerging technologies, just touch screens, voice recognition for people to be what we call input mechanisms. So touch screen, people can use their personal touch screen that you see here, or a touch screen that's located in the vehicle. Eye tracking might also help them control particular features of their user interface. And most of the feedback, so those are the input mechanisms, most of the output mechanisms, how the vehicle will communicate to the human, will be in the form of visual and auditory feedback, also in support of people with different type of sensory disabilities. What I want to talk about here is that this is actually one of our project partners. This is Scheffler Paravan. They've actually developed an app that can enable the user to be able to control these kinds of functionalities. This is just a screenshot of what that app looks like and what it looks like on a tablet versus a smartphone versus a watch. And so, for example, ingress and egress can be controlled on all three of these, but this is what the icons would look like for the person who's wearing a smart watch. Okay, climate would be here, and then entertainment, for example, would be in a tab that's not shown here. But this is the user interface that the user would interact with. This is, again, what the user is inputting. What they actually see is above their head. It's located above their heads, displayed on, let's just say, a 32-inch monitor, where they'll be able to see everything that they're controlling in addition to some additional information. So, for example, we've got navigation located in the center, entertainment, your climate and wipers control, for example. Seating securement would be located here, the video feed that I talked about, and then the remote assistant agent that I mentioned. Now, even though all of these are shown on one screen now, the user does have the option to click on any of these to expand the view to focus on one particular aspect of what they're interested in. That just about sums up, gives a summary of our project. But I do want to acknowledge that we've got a number of community partners that are actually helping us to develop and evaluate the design. For example, the Wabash Area Active Learning Center, known as WALA here in West Lafayette. They are an agency that supports older adults in terms of organizing community and activities. And so they will help us get access to older populations. Bosma, for example, would help us access individuals with blindness, and Easter Seals, people with mobility issues, for example. We're also excited to have a Ford Motor Company consultant who actually has a background in autonomous vehicles as well as UI UX, who's able to give us feedback on the design and development of our Easy Rider project. And that is going to just about wrap up our project. We're happy to answer questions now. This is Professor Duerstock's email address. Feel free to email us with any questions. If you would like to follow our development, we also have the Twitter account. It's at Enhanced Lab. And then we also have provided links here to both of our individual research labs if you'd like to find out more information about who we are, the things that we're doing, and our students. So if that's it, we'll, I guess, stop sharing the screen and try to take questions now. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. So we do have a couple questions for you too. What has user research looked like for this project so far? And what do you expect to do in the future for the prototype as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, the user feedback is a very important part of this process. Right now, we've really focused on just getting the elements together since like the Ollie. And we've been getting, this vehicle has been transported to between Indiana and the research facilities in Knoxville, Tennessee, multiple times already just to get the box, to get the platform. There's different ways of, and the reason for this is so that people have something to look at and or to evaluate. And we really wanted a real world environment that they can explore better than using a CAD simulation or putting something on paper. We will be doing those type of instruments, such as surveys to understand the needs. But in terms of the actual evaluate the design process, we really wanted to build this environment and to say, okay, here's some ideas. Now, what needs to be changed?
Awesome. And what are your next steps for this project, looking ahead for the rest of the year into 2022?
Is really what you just spoke of, this interactive assessment of the design. We're finally getting, we this week got some pictures of the actual Ollie. It's non-functioning, but it has wheels, can be pushed around, and there's putting on doors. But so one can get in there, sit in there, and understand what the space looks like to evaluate that. So we still have to do a lot of putting in the guts or the electronics, such as the multimodal user interface in particular. That's really the next step for the rest of the year.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely a lot of moving parts in there. So one final question regarding the project: what does success look like for the two of you, aside from winning and having this out maybe on the streets?
Well, I'll answer that first, and then I'll let Professor Pitts give his answer, because that's a great question. Success. Certainly, I was excited about this project initially, design challenge, because of the money. No, because really the opportunity to work on emerging technology with the user being a disabled users from the ground up. Too many times, like smartphones, computers, a lot of things, they've been developed and then they have to be modified or retrofitted for people with disabilities. And so that puts people with disabilities as users several years behind the rest of the population. So they're really looking at, okay, what do we need to do to make this something that from the very get-go, autonomous vehicles accessible for people with disabilities. And so the opportunity to not only look at the design, but maybe do some research to show the evidence that, hey, this is really going to work. And I think the design components that we and others come up with is going to be a win-win for everyone. It's just going to be smart design that everyone can appreciate, because autonomous vehicles, it's a new thing. It's a lot of people's going to be very hesitant to do it. And so, as you can tell from the news, any safety issues are going to be very, people are going to be very watchful of those things. And so I'll let the Professor Pitts also add his.
All right. Oh man, I don't know how to come behind that. But I think I would wholeheartedly agree with what's been said. my area of work really focuses on the aging populations, and some people try to convince me that older adults are a type of disabled community, and I don't necessarily agree with that. One of the things we've seen in this project is really the need to understand each individual, their needs, their wants, their expectations, their fears. And so for me, I think success would be seeing all of the groups that we're targeting or we're trying to design for, feeling empowered, feeling like their voice is being heard, feeling like the things that they want, that they need, that the things that they're interested in are actually being put together in something usable, and just to empower them to, number one, live a higher quality of life, but also see themselves in the future of technology. I think that's what success would look like for me.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for your time and sharing more about the project with us. I know I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes and staying up to date on it. So everyone has your contact info, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, last speaker. Our final speaker today is Dr. Dali Szostak, Google's head of UX for trust and safety, where her team focuses on keeping people, especially those at risk, safe on the internet. Dr. Szostak received her Master's of Science in Human Factors Engineering from Embry-Riddle Aeronautic University and her PhD in Engineering User System Interaction from Eindhoven University of Technology. Google recognizes that it's difficult to consider every at-risk person in the design stage, and this talk will present the inclusive design process and framework that Google applies to the wide range of products and how it leads to more inclusive product design in general. So with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. 1 second, let me see if I can share my screen.
Looks great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Sorry about
Perfect.
that. Something to do with Zoom. I also apologize. I can't use your lovely background. For some reason, Zoom is not collaborating with me. But thank you very much for having me. Also, thanks for all the speakers. Really cool topics. I learned a lot today. And driving you home with the last talk. So my name is Dali. Thank you for introducing me. I am the head of UX for a team at Google called Trust and Safety. And I'd like to share a little bit more about our efforts of designing more inclusive and safe experiences. To start, I'd like to start with an exercise. So, first, sorry, I'd like to just make note. I tried to remove most of the graphic content from any of my slides, but it might be that there's some explicit content. Just wanted to let people know in case, so you can be prepared. But I actually like to start with a short thinking exercise for each one of you. So let's say that you are a designer, researcher, UX expert, and someone who's an activist shared in a digital world online that the product you're designing is actually putting them at risk. It's revealing sensitive information and it's just causing them harm. So with this knowledge, if you are a designer, it's just a few questions. What kind of design methods we talked about in some of the talks before about personas and user journeys? What do you think from those methods that will be useful for you to tackle this challenge? If you're more on the research side, how would you go about to recruit people for usability testing of any changes that you make to your product? If you're doing more market type research to understand the landscape, how would you go about doing that? And how would you try to figure out how prevalent this problem is across different platforms? And finally, any person working in UX wants to speak to the users, but in this case, we're putting them at risk with our product. So how would we address our concerns? Being the most simple one, having people sign our NDA. If we have one in place, but even just having them talk to us at all, right? So some of these questions are the ones that we grapple with at Google when we're designing for communities at risk. And TLDR of all of this is that it's really challenging. It's hard. I don't have an answer, and I'm not here to share how we should do it, but at least I can share how we have been improving our processes and trying to incorporate the thinking of how to make our products safer. So once we started to think about the space, just wanted to clarify who are we considering people at risk. We are speaking about people who are facing extreme security challenges, who might be susceptible to harm, danger in the digital or the physical world. And a quick note that, again, a lot of this is work in progress, and terminology is something really important to us. So we keep having conversations around what are the best ways to call people in the security risks. So a lot of the terms I'm using are working terms, and they're definitely in flux. And something that I love to continue chatting with people if you have thoughts on how we can call different communities. So we're in this, for this presentation, we're calling at risk. So people can be at risk because of the work they do, for example. This is a journalist, Mohammed Rasul, and he was detained in 2015 because he was reporting on a story and the Turkish government put him in jail because he downloaded a digital security tool. Happened to be a legal tool, but still they use the law just to jail him, but it was mostly related to the work that he was doing. So the government was able to track him and his colleagues and jail them. He was in jail for about a year. People might be at risk because of where they happen to live and the current situation of their country or the region they're living. This is a picture from 2015 in Syria. And people might also put themselves at risk, right? They're sharing certain information. This is an example of someone that shared that they were coming out and had a lot of digital harassment and insults happening in all different platforms. Sometimes it's not even what people decide to share, but what companies decide to share about people. And you might remember this example from Facebook a few years ago. They made a decision to change the way that you display your name on Facebook. And this affected a lot of people in different ways. So some product decisions, hopefully we're all thinking that we're making them to mitigate harm and abuse, but sometimes we actually create them. So why should we care and think of people at risk? You're probably preaching to the choir in this conference. Really, I shared some examples and they might seem that they're extreme related to security, but we have been observing, and probably all of you can agree, that there's real danger online and it can happen to anyone. Anyone, if you have an account of any kind and you have a presence in the digital world, you can be targeted for hacking and phishing, for impersonation, for threats, or even digital abuse. So when we're thinking as a design industry, a group of experts, we're slowly starting to design accommodating for all people, for different backgrounds, for different shapes, for different abilities. And the reason why we're here today, which is super exciting to have more of these meetings and to bring more of the knowledge. So I'd like to take that even a step further and think about what about including also the moments and the people when they're vulnerable for risk and make it part of this movement as well. We established that being at risk is really an external force factor. So it could be your current situation that you're living, or it can be something that you're encountering in the moment, and that we all might encounter some kind of risk during our lifetime. So designing for safety becomes really important. And we really already do a good job as designers to focus on people. So that's not a problem, right? At least we all have that as part of our method. One of the tools we use, as was mentioned in a previous presentation, is personas. And that was definitely the tool that we started using for designing for safety. But we found that it was limiting, and the use cases were just difficult to portray with personas. So we started flexing the tools, and something that we wanted to propose, and what I wanted to share with you, was that we learned that in the end, no matter who people were specifically, it didn't really matter where they were in the world or when this was happening to them, but we could really distill different moments that we were able to put into a framework and share that as a tool to keep people safe through all of different moments when we were designing for them. So we identified 4 different moments. I will say now that they're not in order. I'm presenting them in order, but it's not necessarily that one happens after the other. They could happen different times, one after the other. I'll present them in linear fashion, but I'll show you later how they can be presented in different manners. So the first one is prevention. This is the moment when people are setting things up for protection for one reason or another. We also have, and I'll go into details about each one of them. The monitoring moment. This is when people are checking to see if it's safe. The moment we want to avoid and what we're designing against basically is the crisis moment. This is the moment when something actually happens. And then finally, we have a recovery moment we're calling, and this is the moment when people are fixing the situation, whatever that was, and rebuilding. With all of different populations that we studied, we started learning there's some commonalities in these moments, and we can go a little deeper and try to think about what will be the user intent and goals, what will be the mental model or the mental state and their stress levels, and what are the different opportunities for design to tackle them. So I'll share a little bit more about each one of them. And this moment is, like I mentioned, people are setting things up. So this might be not a lot of us, but some of us actually go and read the terms of service, right? Those long documents that we have to sign. We might be deciding which permissions we should give to different applications. We might be setting up security or two-factor authentication, all of the different things that we know prevent us from having further harm. So what will be some of the goals someone might have here? Basically trying to preempt bad things from happening. Right? Their stress level might be low. Nothing is actually happening. Maybe they read about it somewhere. So the scenario might be that someone got phished, or they read a news article, or something is they're being aware that there are different things that they could be doing, and maybe they have a little bit of time, so they're actually setting them up. So what are some opportunities for us working in the UX space when we're designing, thinking about this moment of prevention? Something huge that it's interesting. I think we share a lot as UX designers and researchers. It's our optimism, right? A lot of people want to use their powers to change the world, to make things better, and we need that. But it also comes with a cost of always thinking that things won't happen to us. They would not happen to our users for sure. So sometimes we have to fight a little bit of that and try to think about some scenarios when things might not be as happy. We also have an opportunity to explain the cost and benefit of people actually setting up some of these safety tools, right? The cost is time, attention. We don't have a lot of any of those. So how do we, through design, through different tools, actually make it appealing for people to spend the time and set up some of this, like a security key, or explaining why is it worth it to set your phone as a second authentication process. It's a big challenge. And lastly, not letting everything for people to have to do is also one of our challenges. I love thinking of out of the box, right? What are the things that can be defaults that already provide a lot of safety for people, so they don't have to go in and do all the settings. That's how it comes. That's something we're promoting lately a lot at Google, from this way of thinking of like, can it be secure by default and secure by design? So one example here for people who might be in this state, maybe going to a page and reading more about how to do this two-step verification. And as you can see, because we're thinking, okay, people have time and attention, it can be playful, it can have videos, and we can really show the value and make it easy for people to set this process. So I'll move in the second area, monitoring. And this is when people are just checking how their settings, how their permissions, even how the data trails are going. Again, there might be a reason why they're doing this, but some people are more safety aware, and it's an activity they engage in. So people want to make sure nothing bad is happening. Maybe they already set up a lot of things and they want to see if they're working. And their stress level might be a little higher if they're monitoring for a specific reason, but they still have the capacity, the attention to do more complex workflows if needed, which is important. As designers, we need to know where people are so we can design for that moment. The scenario, maybe they received an email notification, lightweight, some kind of suspicious activity, and that might be a reason why they're monitoring. And in terms of our challenges for UX is ensuring that if someone is monitoring, we can show them where they need to look in a way that it's clear, and that we're balancing these two things between how much do we reveal to people in order to be transparent, but also how do we ensure that the information we're revealing is usable. So there's no point in sharing lots of data with people if they cannot make sense of it, right? So this balance between being transparent, but also ensuring that people are actually able to monitor their activity through the tools that we provide. And one example of something we're working a lot, and it's still work in progress, I will say, but there's a dashboard that you can go for your Google products. Here you can monitor, right, what's going on. If you logged in with another device, it will let you know here. You can see if like your two-step security is working correctly and get any kind of notifications all in one place. Third moment is the crisis, and this is the one that we want to avoid again, but it still happens, and it's something that if we tackle and we design for it, then we can support people as they're going through an experience like this. So this is the unfortunate moment when something happens, and some things could be a privacy breach, your account being hacked, and someone stealing your password, installing malware, receiving harassment or threats, or learning that you're being surveilled by your company, by your government, by another institution, etc. In this moment, what is the user goal? Right? Like they just want to understand what's going on and they want to find safety. Those are the two main goals. And we need to make sure that we address them. As far as your stress level, people are very stressed in this moment. So anything we do, we have to keep in mind people are not going to have a lot of attention. They're not going to be able to follow really complex things, and they're very emotional at the moment. Something is happening to them. The scenario, one of the threats or something that I mentioned before is actually happening. And what are our challenges? Like feedback of what's going on, action, what to do next. Those are the two things that people want in the moment. Something that we are getting to design as well is what is the type of emotional and social support that we can provide to people when they're in this moment? How do we acknowledge that this is happening, validate their emotions, and then help them move to the next level? So some examples, I'll move through this a little more quickly as we're running out of time. But I pulled some examples of different products so you can see how a bank will let you know that something is going on, how Yahoo handles it, have an example from Gmail, and also from Spotify. So finally, the recovery phase. This is when people are past the crisis moment and they're ready to fix the situation. So what they want to do as their goal, people want to figure out what went wrong. They want to clean up, rebuild, and move forward. Stress levels still might be high if this is coming right after something that happened, or it might be a little lower. In this scenario, it's definitely someone maybe creating a new account or maybe going back to what they learned about security settings and setting them up. So as far as what our challenges are, this is the moment where maybe we can anticipate problems. We can offer support, we can offer actions that people can follow and take advantage that maybe, that was really unfortunate that something happened, but in the recovery phase, maybe people get better at protecting their account, protecting their data. So we can use that as a learning moment as well. And here are some examples of what we do at Google. We have like a knowledge base that you can learn more about what happens if you get logged out of your Gmail account and some notifications that we send people. So just quickly want to go over 2 examples of how we would model these moments for people at risk. So let's say that we have someone who is a media activist, people that might be very aware of the risk of doing their work and living in digital space and doing their work in digital space. So they will spend a lot of time in the prevention moment, right? They encrypt their machines, they might encrypt their phones, they use VPNs and they set them up. They avoid some technologies like Zoom because it's not secure. So they spend a lot of time in this moment. So they might spend some time in the monitoring moment too, because they want to check that everything they're setting up is working. And hopefully, if they have a crisis, the moments might be shorter and their ability to get out of them it's better because they're better prepared and they also spend less time in the recovery phase. Now, if we look at someone who might be a survivor of partner abuse, you can see how the model is different, right? So maybe people before this event happened to them were not as safety aware as our example before. So the whole digital safety journey starts with the crisis. After that, they will spend a lot of time in the recovery phase, and then equally, that might trigger them to engage more in the prevention phase and in the monitoring phase. And for some people, unfortunately, after being a survivor of some kind of abuse or situation, they spend a lot of time in the monitoring phase. And how do we support people to also start trusting technology again? It's another challenge that comes from this. So to summarize, we propose that we can focus on moments beyond all of the digital design tools that we already have. And we think of different people in our portfolio, people at risk, as people that we want to design for as well. So the states that I propose focus on a series of common situational attributes that we can use to better design for them. And to close, just wanted to make a quick note that as user experience designers and researchers and advocates really for user experience, we know we can't solve everything with design, right? So a big part of our work is to be in conference like this one and become educated about different type of people, different type of, like we learned today, solutions and abilities, and consider people at risk in your design process. That way you can advocate for them, with them together, work closely with the product people in your company and your team that might not be aware of this. So I'm thinking for my case, it's like my PMs or engineers, policy people, or legal team or marketing team. So presenting to them and sharing these use cases just to raise the awareness and making sure that all the needs for someone that might be at risk are also met in your design process. That I'd like to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We are going to open it up to questions now. So one that came through the chat earlier in your talk was some of the things that you were speaking of seem to involve reviewing the design of the product itself. And users may or may not know how their data is being collected, stored, or utilized. So can they answer the question, or can we determine the issue from usability testing in those cases?
That's a really good question. And that's something that when you're working in tech and designing in tech, sometimes you tend to forget, right? That there's all of a spectrum of knowledge, and a lot of things that we think are common sense, everyone knows, actually a lot of people don't know. So I will propose, I mean, there's no one way of raising sort of the knowledge and the ability for people to manage data. I think it's one of those complex problems that require multiple prone solutions. But I would say using all of our sort of toolkits of user research, such as interviewing, thinking of moments, as I proposed, but then personas and less traditional ones, like go on Reddit and read a lot about what people are saying about data and how they're managing it, sort of like to get a better idea of it. Designing with people and also doing a lot of early on testing. Those are some of the methods that we're trying. Obviously, again, requires a lot of different actors to be able to solve this. One, for example, is education and being more involved in how do we share with people what are the risks of just being in the digital world. A lot of the things that just people are not aware. So there's a big movement in supporting people who are doing all of the education. I think it's really important. And I'm thinking, especially, for example, I've been working with in Latin America, just training for women on how to be safe in the digital world. And it includes things like, don't, if you're going to share nudes, don't put your face in a picture, like really understanding what are people doing, and then meeting people and sort of providing different ways that they can be doing the same things, but more safe.
Great, thank you. Another one that came through is regarding two-step authentication. So has two-step authentication been successful in protecting those at risk, or are there other things that you might be seeing?
Yes, it's almost like the vaccine. We know it works. It's just getting people to comply. It takes time, and it's a little bit, the process is still a little bit of a pain. So we're doing a lot of work to try to minimize sort of the process, which sometimes is not as straightforward. So trying different things because it works. It's probably one of the better ways that we have to protect ourselves. So go ahead and do a two-step application. Even taking a step further, we have security keys that are super cheap to get. Go on your computer, and it's actually a device that also authenticate you. So anything that you can do to divert having just one single point of entry to any of your apps, it's safer, definitely.
Great. And then I think we have time for one more question. So with the volume of users that a company like Google has, how do you manage situations with a new or novel issue where prevention has failed or monitoring didn't quite catch that issue? And then taking that a step further, how do people at risk alert Google in those types of situations?
Sorry, I'm muting because my kids just came back home and they're really loud, so I apologize.
No worries.
Yeah, a lot of questions in one. So I will say to answer your last question on how people can let us know. I'm actually giving a talk on this in a few weeks, but it's in Spanish, so I can give you the TLDR. But we found by doing research on this space that the methods that people have to let us know that things were unsafe were really bad. So a few years back, we really tried to overhaul all of our systems to allow people to let us know when safety concerns are happening. Because beyond some researchers, and my team was part of this, but obviously not to the level that needed, going out there and trying to learn what are the current problems, we just weren't hearing from people. And we started wondering why. And once we did the research, we found like the methods that people had to report problems was really poor. So we're in a big process to improve those. They're not 100%, but at least I'm confident that if there is a security challenge that you're being faced with, there's plenty of channels that you can contact us to try to figure out together what's going on. to the other question, I kind of was thinking that we haven't figured that out, right? Like things fail all the time. And when you're thinking, like you were saying about the scale, sometimes it's really scary. Like, how do we get out of that mindset of like having to have things perfect in order for us to be able to test them in the wild? And if you see the evolution of a company like Google, early on, we were really big on launching things and testing them. And if you think of all the Google products, they were kind of crappy. And then we're slowly moving to do more design and research and kind of be more sure that at least we did a lot of checks before releasing anything into the world. And some of those checks include accessibility. So like today we wouldn't release anything that hasn't been checked for color, variations, for sound considerations, etc. So for digital security, this is something I'm internally trying to move forward, is like, what if we had something similar? Well, we will vet not only for Google security, but also our user security. And the idea will be like, there should be some minimum standards that we will need to hit before anything can be released into the wild. We're not there yet, but I can definitely say that we are super aligned with accessibility and like doing a lot of advances in that space. And that's why the talk that I just gave, it's actually something that I've been doing internally too, to convince all my colleagues, like, let's think about users at risk. Let's think about the situations. Can we convince our PMs, our Eng team, that it's worth spending the time to make this more secure? And one of the tools that I've been using, something that you might be able to use in your company, instead of the cost of bad publicity. So not only obviously affecting people is like our number one thing, but sometimes that's when people hear, what are the risks of the New York Times picking this up and doing a whole article on it? And it's because we just didn't think of it ahead of time. And we can think of all of the issues, but I think right now there are plenty of them that we can anticipate at least, and really try to design for before it hits people and before it actually creates a concern.
No worries. Well, thank you so much for that answer and your time and presentation today. That is all the time that we have, and I know you have to hop off as well. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so that is all that we have for today's event. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this is just the first event that will be happening from the Experience Innovation Center, and we will be hosting many more in 2022. We'd love to know from you what you would want to see in the future, topics, everything like that. So a survey will be available once you leave the event. And I'd like to say thank you to our speakers for sharing their unique insights, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. A recording and a copy of slides will be made available. They'll be emailed out shortly after this, and also available on our LinkedIn and YouTube channels. So if you want to learn more and stay up to date with what we're doing at Experience Innovation Center, please visit our website, reach out to us at the email, and we hope to see you at our next event. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your Tuesday.